My name is Sarah Cooper. I teach in the Department of City Planning here in the Faculty of Architecture, and I'm happy to welcome you all here this evening. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to introduce Sheryl-Ann. This is Sheryl-Ann Simpson. I actually first met her like 10 years ago or something, but you know, it was only a couple of months ago that I found out she's actually not from Winnipeg, because she really loves Winnipeg. She comes here every chance she gets, so I just assumed that she had family here, or she was from here, or something, but no, it turns out, no, she's from Toronto. She just really loves Winnipeg. So anyways, now, she's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. Her research and teaching focuses on the relationship between the state and the everyday, and we'll hear about that this evening. She studies this broad idea through questions around immigration, settlement, and citizenship, and environmental justice and urban health. And she's also taught in community development and planning at Clark University, and landscape architecture and environmental design at the University of California, Davis. So please join me in welcoming Sheryl-Ann Simpson.
Thank you, Sarah. It is true, I do really love Winnipeg. Thank you so much, guys, for the invitation to be here. It's funny, I've been probably coming to Winnipeg and Manitoba pretty consistently over the past decade or so. So it's really exciting to get to be here to share some of what I've learned from being on these territories, on these lands, that have really helped to shape my understanding of the urban, but also more broadly my understanding of planning processes, environmental design processes. So I'm really excited to get to share some of that with you guys. And then I'm just really excited to be in this department. The folks in the planning department, whether or not they know it, have also been really influential in terms of my practice. Richard's work is actually part of why I got into planning in the first place and why I stuck around in it. I've taught Orly and Sarah's work in my classes in California and now in Ottawa. So it's really exciting to get to just spend some time with these folks and get to sort of see this wonderful department that's built so much really fascinating knowledge that I've used a lot in my work as well. So I'm really excited to get to share with you guys as well some of what the influence of your work has brought about. I'm not blaming you for anything, I'm just thanking you for the influence. Just the other thing, I also just want to thank Aaron and Brandy so much for organizing everything and getting me out here. And Aaron asked right when I started if there was any sound, and I don't have any sound, but there is a portion of the event, there's a vaguely interactive portion of the event where if you have your phone with you and you feel like using it and you go to this link, a couple of slides in, there's going to be a chance where I say again, if people want to hit play on that sound, they can. And it doesn't have to be in sync, so there's no order to it. But you'll see that link again, it'll come up, and I encourage you to join in with some sound making. Okay. So as Sarah said, a lot of my work really focuses on this question of the relationship between the state and communities. And so I kind of focus that thinking through this idea of citizenship. And citizenship, I think, has become, again, a really important framework, a really important theme in our politics more generally, in our lives more broadly, and definitely, I think, in terms of practices around both planning and the other environmental design fields. And when I'm talking about citizenship, we're not just talking about kind of formal membership, so not just thinking about who has a passport, not just thinking about who has the legal right to remain, but also thinking about these broader questions around decision-making, around membership more particularly. Who counts as a citizen? Who's recognized by other citizens as a citizen, regardless of their legal status? And also thinking about this idea of ordinary citizenship. And so ordinary in a couple of different ways, thinking about ordinary in terms of the everyday, but also thinking about ordinary in terms of processes of ordering. What are the ways in which we make order? What are the ways in which we're ordered into particular kinds of behavior, decision-making processes, land use processes, et cetera. So this idea of ordinary citizenship. And a lot of the folks who have been studying and focusing on ordinary citizenship have been doing really amazing work, but there's some limitations to the work that's happened so far. A lot of it has really been focused on large cities. So it's been focused on places that are sort of very big, very dense, where there's lots of conflicts over land, lots of bustling up against each other. And there's been this focus on sort of action, right? That's been the main way in which they've been trying to recognize ordinary citizenship, is by understanding sort of citizenship actions. And that leaves out a lot of actors, but it also leaves out a lot of other elements that could potentially help us to understand what this ordinary citizenship looks like, and also potentially think about what other forms of citizenship could be. So some of the limitations include the fact that again, it's been this focus on action rather than things like narrative, for example, rather than processes of collective memory or collective memory making. Again, we've been focused more on these large sort of metropolitan cities, not thinking about the cities that are kind of off the map, quote unquote. So thinking about smaller cities, second cities, ordinary cities, but also thinking about suburbs, thinking about rural areas. And again, because that focus has been on large cities, because that focus has been on action, it's also been thinking about citizenship through the lens of people who are already citizens, rather than trying to understand how folks who are outside of citizenship, excluded from it, on the cusp of it, how do they understand citizenship? How do they recognize it? How do they try and assert it in these ordinary ways? So both in terms of the everyday and in terms of creating new orders. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about a couple of methods and a couple of projects where I've been trying to kind of address some of these limitations and share with you some of the ways in which I've been trying to think through and research these ideas. Sorry. So the more that I kind of think about and put these all together, I think what a lot of the methods and methodologies that I've been using have in common is really this focus on what folks call kind of a more than representational approach. So an approach that's really focused on thinking about the ways in which experience, emotion, affect, the body are all these tools that we learn through, all these tools through which we build knowledge through. And a lot of my work, more and more, has really been focused on this idea of these relationships between the body and land in particular. So really thinking about the ways in which people deal materially with land, their emotional attachment to it, the kind of affect that happens materially through land, the kind of relationships to land that people have that are then producing place for them, then producing opportunities for or examples of citizenship for them. So the vaguely obscure title comes out of this thinking about land. And so Kenneth Ulwig, who is a landscape geographer, traces the history of the word landscape in some really interesting ways. And he focuses actually on kind of the sort of Germanic and Danish origins of the word, and thinking about the idea that when you break it down in those Germanic languages, landscape breaks into kind of a couple of different meanings. And so it breaks into this idea of land, or Länder, people or the peoples. Länder is the plural of that, so it's peoples. And so it's people who are sort of conjured or brought together or shaped through a set of customary laws. And so he points out the ways in which landscapes, in sort of the original meaning of the word, landskaber, wasn't so much about the place itself, but it was about the relationship and the way in which those relationships then shaped the lands, then shaped the place. And so that's been one of the ways that I've been trying to think through this relationship between land and between people, this relationship between states and communities, the ways in which that relationship then shapes places, the ways in which people are or aren't able to engage in decision-making around those landscapes, the ways in which those landscapes shift people's perspectives of their own relationships in place. So again, it's this idea of thinking about sort of the physical land, the material idea of place, whether that's a built environment or a more naturalized environment, but then also trying to think about the Länder, thinking about the people and their place on the land. So I recognize it is completely absurd for me to travel all the way here to Treaty 1 territory to talk to you about a Scandinavian perspective of land that incorporates people in terms of land relationships. And so the sort of secret title of this talk would be Agi Landlander, and that idea of really trying to think about and incorporate, for example, Anishinaabe notions of land. Sheryl-Ann Simpson, for example, talks about the idea of a practice of agi, so a practice of land. And so this idea, or a process, pardon me, of land. So this idea that land is a process, right? That land is something that is being produced continuously, and that our bodies are being produced continuously with that land as well. And so that's definitely something that I am trying more and more to incorporate into my work, and trying to do that in a material way. So not just doing what Ananya Roy recently referred to as a citationary alibi. So that idea of just kind of adding indigenous references here and there to just sort of seem like I'm dealing with these ideas, but trying to incorporate more deeply these other meanings of land and other meaning of land relationships as well. So also folks like Erica Violet Lee, who talks about sort of theorizing with the prairies, and folks like Eve Tuck as well. Their work is definitely influencing my thinking, and hopefully more and more influencing the methods that I use to engage with these questions. So what I'm going to talk about today are 3 examples, and again, sort of 3 methods or methodologies that I'm using to try and engage in this question of the relationship between sort of the material or physical aspects of land and the relationships to the people. So I'm going to talk about a narrative mapping project that was focused on immigration and settlement here in Winnipeg and also in Copenhagen. I'm going to talk about a project that is sort of using this idea of trying to sort of see use value in terms specifically of thinking about the impact of the deep drought in California on residential landscapes in Sacramento, California. And then I'm going to talk about this idea of sound space. So this idea of really using sound as a method to understand and analyze land and the relationships between land and people and people in their own communities. And that's a project that's ongoing for me, working in Western Manitoba, mostly in the Parkland. Okay, so this is the first project, and it's very lovely to be here, so I don't have to explain where Winnipeg is. You guys hopefully all know where Winnipeg is. But the project was a comparative project looking at sort of some of the West End neighborhoods in Winnipeg, and then also looking at a city in the States that I'm not going to talk about today, but then also looking at a neighborhood in Copenhagen in Denmark called Nobro, which is the little white dot there. And you can see from these cartograms, what I was looking at was this question of immigration in these cities. And so I was looking at cities that probably a decade or so before I had started, immigration really wouldn't have been a conversation. It really wasn't a question that people were thinking about or talking about. But in the subsequent year, there had been a real increase and also a diversification in terms of who was moving to these cities and where they were moving from. And so I was looking at the processes that were being put in place to work in terms of settlement, in terms of integration and incorporation in these cities. And looking at it from the perspective of nonprofit organizations, looking at it from the perspective of neighborhood scales. And so when I went into the project, I really was going into it looking at it from this sort of institutional perspective, trying to understand what were the organizations doing, trying to understand how the different policy settings were shifting the work of the organizations, but also really interested in the perspective of the folks that were also actually doing the immigrating, the settling, the integrating, the incorporating, trying to kind of understand what their perspectives were in terms of these processes as well, to be able to compare across them. And so I think, the important thing that came out of that, right, this was sort of one of the sparks for thinking about this kind of relationship to place in a slightly different way, was in interviewing people and working alongside them in sort of volunteer positions and just observing the cities in general. It was really fascinating to hear how people talked about place and to hear how people kind of understood and envisioned it. And also to hear how people were making specific claims around citizenship based on their interactions in their neighborhoods, based on the ways in which they were stewarding their neighborhoods, the kinds of displays they were making in their neighborhoods, the kinds of information they were sharing in their neighborhoods. People were analyzing their own actions, their own experiences, very much as acts of citizenship, which is not how it was sort of explained to me as a planning student. It was not how it was explained to me if I sort of looked at more formal definitions of citizenship. So I wanted to kind of understand how people were understanding these spaces that they were living in, and wanted to understand how they saw them intertwined with their journeys through the settlement process. So I use these sort of narrative maps to try and draw out these stories. And so I'll just show you sort of two examples that I just sort of really love from this sort of larger corpus of interviews. So one is a quote that came from a young woman who lived here in Winnipeg with her family. She was talking specifically about her neighborhood, and she told this particular story. So she says, right now, some neighbors are like not clean, and they let their dogs out, and they don't clean it. So what I do is, because I want to make the area better, I call the city. One of my neighbors, he cleans the dog poo and he throws it. He just puts it in front of the dog owner's house. He is Canadian. I have to be brave like him. I'd rather keep it as confidential. And so this story was embedded in sort of a broader narrative where she talked really about sort of how, for her, part of becoming Canadian was this idea not just of stewardship, but of like a very particular kind of stewardship. And so she talked about how, for her, she would actually rather not engage with people directly, how she still didn't feel like she had enough ownership to kind of engage with people directly. But the state became a tool for her to actually engage in place. The state became a tool for her to become sort of a decision maker in this small way in her neighborhood, but again, attached to these broader relationships. And so this was very different as compared to the American case or the Danish case in terms of this sort of the role of the state and the relationship of state. And so this sort of very fine-grained story, right, about sort of what do you do when someone lets a dog take a poop in front of your house, right, became this much broader narrative for her about her relationship to state and about her understanding of sort of what Canadianness could be or should be for her. And so again, it was sort of all these like sort of fine-grained descriptions that people used and the ways that they attached them up to these much broader scales that became really interesting to me. So as part of the interviews, I also collected a set of what I refer to as narrative maps. So I asked people to draw pictures of the city, but I asked people to draw pictures of their city, just the parts that they used, the places they cared about, the places that were important to them. And so this is just one example, and it comes, it's one of the maps from Copenhagen, from that neighborhood Nobro. And in Copenhagen, there's a couple of sort of interesting tropes about immigration that were being told, and a lot of them are sort of held within this one map. So on your right-hand side, you'll see this little bicycle. And so Copenhagen's one of these places that as planners, we know this, as landscape architects, you know this, as urbanists, you hear about this as well. Copenhagen's one of those bike cities. And it's very proud of that bike cityness, and that bike cityness has increasingly become incorporated into the sense of what it means to be a Copenhagener. So actually, you can pretty much get funding from the city, like anybody can pretty much get funding from the city if you are starting a program that is buying bikes for immigrant youth or teaching immigrant women how to ride a bike. If you're gonna do that, the city will give you money to do that. Because for them, that's part of this process of incorporation, right? It's part of this process of bringing people into place. And so the neighborhood that this resident lived in was actually a neighborhood that was considered a bit of a problem in Copenhagen. Copenhagen has what they call, or Denmark as a whole has what they've called ghettoområder, so ghetto places. And places are designated as ghettoområder if they have more than 50% of their residents who are non-European immigrants, if a certain percent of folks are not in work or school, and if a certain percent of folks have been imprisoned in the past little bit. That's sort of the definition of a ghetto. And so this is one of those areas that's been designated in that way. So it's a place that's been designated as outside of the Danish state. And so in a funny way, though, right, having these little hints of like bicycles in there was actually, as the narrator talked about it, he talked about the idea that actually this was sort of part of the sort of Danish character of the place. And he was very sort of aware and conscious both of the narrative around the place and also the ways in which people were countering that narrative through these everyday actions. The other thing, though, that was really interesting is if you look at these buildings, you see all of these little round circles. So those are all satellite dishes. And satellite dishes are this weird theme that reappear over and over again in Danish policy. There's a Danish policy document, for example, that was written sort of in the mid-2000s that sort of lays down the ghetto policy. And the image is specifically the image of a tower block with satellites on it. And so this is actually considered a real problem for the Danish state. And the way that the illustrator described it to me, the way the narrator described it to me, was that you could tell where people were from based on where the satellite dishes faced. I've since been told that's not how satellite dishes work. I don't know, but that was sort of his interpretation of it. And the point was that the satellite dishes faced in all of these different directions. And so it was all these people sort of pointing towards home. But at the same time, right, the sense was that everybody was pointing towards different homes at the same time that they were producing this new place together. And when you talk to youth from this area in particular, they talked about sort of Danish-born youth in this area. They talked about sort of not feeling at home necessarily in the rest of the city, not feeling at home in their parents' countries or their parents' cities of origin, but feeling at home in their own neighborhoods, in part because of this combination of satellite dishes pointing in all directions, alongside bicycles, alongside. So again, it was this idea of a new kind of citizenship, a sort of liminal citizenship, where people weren't being invited into the Danish state itself, but they were still creating these moments to make decisions. They were still creating these moments to build membership, and they were arguing for a kind of a different kind of Danish citizenship, not outside of or parallel to the existing state, but really shifting it in these interesting ways. And so, like I said, I collected through all my interviews, for the most part, folks were willing to do this mapping with me, which was really great. And then I had this kind of stack of maps, and I had to think about what to do with them. And so what I wanted to do was really to think about an analysis that really honored the material that I had been given. So rather than just writing about it, rather than just shifting hard into sort of a quantitative GIS kind of perspective, to think about how you could analyze this in a visual way, how you could analyze this maintaining some of the emotion, how you could analyze this maintaining some of the affect and relationships that people had to place. And so this is sort of part of that analysis process. There's a book that I meant to bring with me, but I forgot, but that I called sort of it's a sort of atlas, where I kind of went through and tried to pull out in the same way that you would pull out quotes and themes from text, to sort of do that same work, but to do it in a visual way. And specifically to visualize reflecting the kinds of visualizations that people presented on the maps. And actually getting people to draw these maps were quite challenging because, as I forget, adults don't actually like to draw things. I did my test maps with a bunch of working artists and arts educators, which was a huge mistake. So everything went very smoothly when I did my test interviews. And then when I actually went out into the field, everyone was very reticent to actually draw, obviously. So again, right, wanting to have that analysis reflect and honor the work that people did. So these are just two kind of almost pages of quotes from that. One was around home spaces, the theme of home spaces, and one is around the theme of green spaces. So these are kind of all the different ways that people illustrated their homes, their sort of current home spaces, and then all the different kinds of green spaces that people illustrated on their maps. And the home spaces in particular are really interesting. If you kind of, as you look through them, there are all these different kind of formats, right? Everything from somebody just drawing a dot or drawing a little star, to people being very particular about the type of houses that people drew. And so, for example, I had one person who was here in Winnipeg, but who drew a kind of style of home. The way she described it was, this is the style of home back home in Korea. Other people described it as, this is the style of home we have back in Africa. And so in some ways, it was this idea that they were sort of placing home on this map, right? So bringing a little piece of Korea to Winnipeg, bringing a little piece of East Africa to Winnipeg, right? And so these maps were really maps in 4 dimensions, is how I often describe them, where the past, the present, and the future were intermingled in really interesting ways on the map. And particularly for newer immigrant residents, there was a lot of sort of chatter about the future on this map. So chatter about places that they wanted to be important to them in the future. And so for some people, that was a neighborhood they were hoping to live in. For some people, that was an education or a job that they were hoping to be engaged in. But again, right, this process of thinking about these maps in this narrative way, trying to understand people's experiences, trying to understand the emotions that they had attached to it, meant that they drew very different kinds of landscapes than they would have if I was trying to just understand where did they go in a day. And so the other part of the analysis was, again, trying to do this synthesis, trying to sort of bring these themes together, spatialize them, think about that temporal element as well. And so this is a map that just sort of, that gives like a general summary of the major themes that I saw. And so that big circle is home. That's sort of what most people started with on their maps. It was kind of at the center of it. The little grassy circles are green spaces. The little squares are workplaces. The dark dots were food. There's a lot of food on people's maps. The sort of open circles are friends and family, and then the cross-haired circles are supports, so nonprofit organizations, government services that people used every day. And then the two sort of, the weird blobby spaces I called Verbunda, or forbidden spaces. So these were all the places on the map that people sort of said, either I don't go here, or more specifically, I don't feel welcome here. I don't feel like this is my place. And these were also often the places on a city map that are sort of the most valorized. So for example, in Winnipeg, thinking about sort of the Exchange District, thinking about sort of downtown Winnipeg, even thinking about things like the Forks, like thinking about all of those things where a city really promotes itself, those were often the spaces where people felt the least welcome or the most forbidden. And then the last space, that sort of little purple blob, were these sort of spaces of desire. And so they were all the spaces that people kind of hoped would become important to them. And I thought it was important to add that on the map and to give it a really special space. And for a lot of folks, it was really far away. It was really far away from home. It was really far away from their current conditions. There were a lot of those Verbunda, a lot of those forbidden spaces in between kind of where they were and where they were hoping to be. And there were a couple of other sort of themed maps that I did. One of them was what I called the New Mom map. And so new moms had a really different geography of their maps as compared to other residents. There were a lot more green spaces on them, a lot more services on them, and new moms were much more likely to include transportation on their maps. So thinking about buses, thinking about trains, thinking about that road that didn't get plowed, that taxi that was difficult to get to. And so that was much more present on the maps of new moms than it was on sort of the population at whole. And so again, right, this process of narrative mapping giving us a sense of not just what's important, but also a sense of sort of how might we build the map if we were, how might we build the city if we were thinking about these experiences of new moms as they're trying to move through the city in these different ways. So shifting geographies and shifting gears to Sacramento in California. So Sacramento is the capital of California. It's a city that's actually weirdly similar to Winnipeg in some ways in terms of size, in terms of being a capital. But it's very different, obviously, than Winnipeg in a lot of other ways. And one of the really interesting things about Sacramento is that it's a city that prides itself on being one of the most diverse in the US. But that diversity doesn't mean that people are sort of living and working alongside of each other. And so in this project, what we were thinking about was we were in the middle of what I've been calling kind of the deep drought in California. There's sort of a 5 to 7 year chunk of time where California saw the lowest water, sort of the lowest rainfall levels that it had seen. There was a lot of groundwater that was pumped out of the ground for agriculture. There was just sort of like a sense of crisis in the state. And so in the middle of that sense of crisis, the governor decided that all the cities had to cut their urban water use by about 10%. That was kind of the mandate across the board. All cities had to do that. The other thing about California is a hugely suburbanized state. So whether you're in a very low-income neighborhood, whether you're in a very high-income neighborhood, you're often going to find that you have this sort of pattern of single-family homes with yards. And so on average, Californians are using 50 to 70% of their household water is on outdoor use. So that became a thing that a lot of cities really tried to target, to change the way that people were using water outside and to change the form of people's yards themselves. So in Sacramento, there was a couple of different things that they tried to do. One of them was to actually finally add water meters to houses, because there had been no water meters in Sacramento up until this point. So that was one strategy that they used. The other were just sort of water restrictions. So you could only water your lawn twice a week between these hours and these hours. There were fines that were involved. People were encouraged to kind of like narc on their neighbors. So if you saw your neighbor watering at 11 o'clock on a Thursday, there was like a hotline you were supposed to call to turn them in. And then there was also sort of more general sort of positive promotions around this as well. So just quickly, this is the area of the city that we were working on, this kind of transect of neighborhoods. On the very far left, that kind of cluster of neighborhoods is Land Park. In the middle-ish is a neighborhood called Oak Park, and we'll just kind of pay attention to those more as I chat about this project. But if you notice kind of the demographics, so on your far left is percent Latino, in the middle, Black and African American, and then on the right, the white population. And so you'll see that there's sort of a pretty strong flip-flop, particularly if you look at sort of the white and Black populations in terms of where people are. And then on the bottom maps are the percent renter households, the median rent, and then the housing value in these neighborhoods. And you'll notice that the housing value sort of follows the white population pretty clearly. And so again, right, it's unfortunately a pretty classic American pattern, right, where there is a lot of segregation between these neighborhoods, a real distinction in terms of the demographics, both in terms of race and ethnicity and in terms of class and income. But again, what's really interesting is that it's a neighborhood where the form of the neighborhoods are surprisingly similar. While the value of the houses are a lot higher, they're not actually on they're on lots that are sort of comparable sizes. The house footprint, at least, is also often relatively comparable. So it's a really interesting kind of case to look at to try and think about this relationship between environmental and ecological change and the impacts that it's going to have, but also to think about the ways in which policy and design impact people, whether it builds more resilience or whether it builds more vulnerability to the sort of climate catastrophe that we're in the middle of. And so this was another one of the sort of last strategy, was the more positive strategy, where the city was encouraging people to do things like let your lawn go dormant during the hottest summer months. And they also had a program of turf removal. So the city would sort of reimburse you for a certain amount if you removed your turf grass lawn, and if you put in a very sort of prescribed landscape, what they were calling a river-friendly landscape. So there was sort of one landscape that you get funding to replace it with. Only owners could take advantage of this. So if you were a renter, no matter how long you had been there, no matter what the relationship was to the landlord, it had to be the home owner, not necessarily the resident, that was involved in this project. And also the lawns had to start at pristine for you to get the rebate. So this is what we did, and the we is really important. I had a team of an amazing series of research assistants that I worked with. Arturo Ortiz, Camille Allschultz, and Magdalena Aravena in particular, and then a bunch of other interns that also worked with us. And so what we did was we went ahead and we decided that we weren't going to sort of take this as a starting point of green lawn's good, bad lawn, brown lawn's bad. We weren't going to sort of take it as a starting point that the folks who had done the transformation were clearly the heroes and the folks who hadn't were clearly the villains of this story. We really wanted to understand what was actually going on in these neighborhoods, and we wanted to understand how people were using and how people were valuing their residential landscapes. So we went out and we did we did sub-parcel surveys of about 150 homes across this transect. And we looked at them both kind of quantitatively and qualitatively. And so our interns and the research assistants did all these really great illustrations to sort of map out what was going on each of these different lawns. We also kind of had a checklist where we went through and we sort of saw how people were actually using them, what was on the lawn, who was on the lawn, what were the sort of different traces of use that we could find. And so the initial sort of round of evaluation that we've done, initial round of analysis that we've done with this data, is just to look at the lawns, since that was kind of the major thrust of the policy, and to see what's going on across this transect just in terms of the lawns. And so this is the percent lawn across the transect, and you notice there's like a couple of sort of funny things. So Alhambra Triangle, and it's roughly in the same direction as the maps themselves as well. So if you can kind of picture the maps in your head, it kind of goes in the same direction. So Alhambra Triangle, which is a sort of smaller neighborhood, it's the neighborhood where we saw the most lawn conversion, sort of the most neighbors that either had no lawns at all or that were kind of pulling up their lawns. But one of the things that we found really surprising was Land Park and Oak Park. So Land Park, if you'll remember, is that neighborhood kind of all the way on the west. It's sort of the whitest. It is one of the most affluent neighborhoods, not just in the transect, but in the city. And then Oak Park has the largest African-American population. It's actually sort of an historic African-American enclave. It also has the highest number of renters. It has the sort of lowest income, the lowest housing value. And so one thing that kind of surprised us as we started to do this measurement was that in terms of lawn cover, Land Park and Oak Park were actually the neighborhoods that were most similar to each other. And so that felt a bit perplexing. But we kept on going, and we started to look at lawn quality. So we looked at kind of this question of, where was there no lawns at all, and then looking at kind of the quality of the lawns, and looking at it from this perspective of, if we were coming to determine whether or not the lawns were eligible for this conversion process, what would we think about that? And so Alhambra, again, you see has that sort of large black bar. That's the none. And this is where Oak Park and Land Park suddenly differentiated themselves quite a bit from each other. And so the quality of lawns in Oak Park was significantly, it's the neighborhood with the most poor quality lawns, whereas Land Park is the neighborhood with the most excellent quality lawns, right? So they're both neighborhoods with a lot of lawns, but the lawns themselves are diverging vastly from each other. And as we begin to kind of dig in more to our analysis, right, one of the things that we're kind of highlighting and one of the things that we're really noticing is the ways in which people in these neighborhoods, broadly speaking, obviously, are really valuing their lawns in very different ways, valuing their land in really different way. And so in Land Park, a lot of it is about display. There's it's just a beautiful lawn. There's nothing on the lawn. There's no signs of use. You never see anybody on these front lawns, but they're just these sort of beautiful carpets that kind of maintain the property value of their homes. Whereas in Oak Park, the lawns are very active spaces. People are storing things on there, they are having parties on there, kids are playing on there, right? There's all these signs of use, kind of these constant signs of use that are happening in these yards. This is just one example. There's a family that, it's a long story, but the long and the short of it is that they've actually sort of built this amazing food garden in their backyard and are also helping other people to build food gardens across Oak Park. And so this is just one example of them they've also, in addition to food, they're also planting medicinal herbs. They're also helping people to think about sort of different medicinal herbs from different traditions. And these are all the things that aren't included in the policy around water use and around turfgrass removal. All of these experiential qualities of land, all of these ways that people have sort of use value in terms of their land, all these relationships to land aren't included anywhere in the policy. The policy is focused strictly on this question of water reduction, and it's focused strictly on this very one sort of visual way that you can reduce water use in your lawn. And so it's an interesting challenge, right, to think about what would a sustainability policy look like that had to actually take into account people's spiritual relationships to their backyards. That's not often something that we think about in planning school. Okay, so just quickly, the last example. We're back in Manitoba. Now we are sort of on the prairies properly. We are in Western Manitoba in Parkland. And I'm working on a project there now that is very much ongoing. But it's, again, trying to think about this question of citizenship and specifically citizenship formation. So really trying to understand sort of how do people see themselves as becoming citizens. And so I'm thinking about this both from the perspective of young adults and from the perspective of new Canadians. So thinking along kind of both of those tracks of folks and thinking about it in this particular place. So for folks who haven't been out to Parkland, I highly recommend it. It is beautiful country. Right now the ski slopes are open, which is very hard to explain to people outside of Manitoba, but it is real and it is true. In the summer, the beaches are amazing, also really hard to explain to people who aren't from Manitoba, but also very real and very true. And so again, right, there's all these kinds of different sort of naturalized landscapes, which are in some ways what we often think about when we think about rural places. But this is also parkland. There's all these sort of things that we might not think about when we think about rural places. And so, for example, there's the kind of constant traffic jams that come with road constructions. There's all this kind of commuting and all this transport that happens. There's the sort of one tower block in Dauphin that I really love. But it's mostly social housing, housing for elders. And then I think it was 2 summers ago, in the national park, there was the first Pride Festival that happened in the national park in the region. So in a funny way, right, this area of the province combines a lot of the sort of major questions that we're thinking about in Canada more broadly. Even more so, actually, than working in some of the cities in Canada, right? So we've got this kind of question of demographic shift. We've got this question of sort of the economics of work, the economics of housing. And it's a place where people are actually coming back to or staying, younger people more and more, in part because they've moved to Toronto, they've moved to Calgary, and then they've hit sort of that mid-late 20s, and they're thinking about family, they're thinking about having kids, and all of a sudden, the fact that you could kind of stay in Toronto and live in a tiny, or Vancouver, and live in a tiny, one-bedroom apartment, trying to figure out how you build another loft for your kid and pay for childcare, or you could go back home, buy an actual house, and be surrounded by family who would also support that process. So the population is stabilizing in this region after it's fallen for decades and decades for a couple of different reasons. The provincial nominee program also meant that a lot of people, more people have moved to the area from a more diverse range of places. And folks are also coming home to retire as well. So people who moved away, whether it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, have come back as well as they've been retiring. So the population is actually stabilizing. There's also, obviously, a very strong Indigenous presence, right, that is not always in conversation with the non-Indigenous presence. So that those, that sort of 2 at least groups of folks are not always in conversation, even if they are in close proximity. So again, right, there's just all these really interesting demographic changes that are happening in the region that I think actually make it a really fruitful place for us to think about this question of membership in the Canadian context. And so I've been trying to do that in a couple of different ways, and one of the ways in which I've been doing that is, again, through this idea of trying to use sound as a method. And so I've been thinking about this idea of sound space, so different from soundscapes, which is kind of the term that people often use. But soundscapes in a lot of ways is this idea, more than anything else, of kind of a collection of sounds. And especially in terms of the way that Murray Schafer, who's kind of one of the coiners of the term, used it, that collection of sound was very particular. It was very much sort of about what he thought represented pure sound. So there's a really sharp divide between sort of amplified sound and quote-unquote natural sound, rural sound and urban sound, beautiful sound and noise. There's this really kind of sharp divide between those. And so thinking about soundspace doesn't try to make those kinds of preconceived divisions, but instead I'm really more thinking about sound in the way that people like John Cage, who is a composer, thought about sound. And that's the idea, again, of trying to understand what the work is that sound does. And so John Cage has this great quote where he talks about the idea that the silence that we're most likely to experience is the silence of traffic in most cities. And that idea that he loves the silence of traffic because it's always doing new things. It's always sort of working in new ways. And the other end of that is that it also, it lets the idea of space be open as well. So we're not sort of saying that rural space is always going to be quiet, that it's always going to be still, that it's always going to sort of stay the same, but also acknowledging that the space and the sort of rural space is also shifting and changing as well. So trying to understand the work that sound does, trying to understand the ways in which it impacts space, it produces space, the ways in which people relate to space differently through sound. So I'll just give you two quick examples. Like I said, this is kind of ongoing work. Also, though, this is a moment where, at the top again, if you would like to sort of indulge in some of this sound, you can sort of click play on that. Okay, so this is from one of these young Canadians who's kind of lived in the region her whole life. And as we were sort of going through the interview, she talks about this idea. She starts to talk about kind of why she hated living in Winnipeg and what she loves about being back in Parkland. And she talks about the idea of, like here you wake up in the morning. It's funny, like one time I was talking to my auntie on the phone. She lives in Winnipeg, which is hilarious because she hates it too. But it's where her husband was from, so that's where they are. And she said to me, "It's so nice talking to you in the morning because I can hear the birds over the phone." And even me, I was like, I love the birds. I love listening to that with a coffee on my front stoop. Yeah, I love it, but it's something I take for granted until she said it. So it's those kinds of things. So again, if we're thinking about this from a soundscape perspective, these sort of background noises transmitted over the phone would just be noise, more so than anything else. And there would be this sharp divide we would conceive of between the experience of being, quote unquote, actually in the country and getting to listen to the birds live on your porch, and being in the city and having to listen to sort of this amplified noise through the phone. But what this narrator kind of went on to explain, and what she's narrating here, is the idea that actually there's a really interesting relationship that's happening. That sound sort of brings her aunt back home, right? Just hearing that sound is kind of a way that she's brought back home, but also a way that she keeps connections to home. These kind of regular phone calls, right? This sort of transmission of sound is this way of sort of breaking down the distance between Winnipeg and the Parkland. It sort of brings people together in a different way. It also helps the narrator to slow down and really appreciate the place that she's in. So this quiet background noise becomes foreground noise for her because of her aunt's attention to it, because of the way that her aunt relates to it. And it makes her think about her love for place in a very different way than she would have thought about it otherwise. So again, this idea of understanding how we learn through the body, this idea of understanding the ways in which our place in the world, we kind of learn it, we potentially learn it through sound, through this process of listening physically. And then finally, it's a longer quote, I won't read all of it, I'll kind of skip around. But this actually came out of interviews I was doing in Winnipeg, and again, it was a sort of process of trying to understand people's experience of place, how they understood the city. And one narrator actually started talking about Parkland while we were in Winnipeg, in terms of his experience of the city and in terms of sort of his understanding of it. This was actually one of the things that he actually started to talk about. And so he talked about the idea that the place that I actually like the most is the lakes, and then asked me if I'd been there. I hadn't yet. He admonished me that I had to go. I definitely had to make it out there. And this is somebody who had moved from East Africa probably about 3 years before this interview and was living in Winnipeg with his family. And so he starts to talk about the idea that maybe the lake is part of the culture of Canada. He explained the way that for him back home, they had the village. So people would go to the village. It's where your great-grandparents would be, your great-aunts, and you would kind of go there whenever you could to build these connections. And it was this idea that people had time to sit and to talk. And then he talked about how in the city that wasn't there. And this was a prominent theme for folks in Winnipeg, for new Canadians in Winnipeg, was this idea that there was no time to sit and talk. And then he talked about why that sitting and talking was important, why that sort of sound of slow talk was important for him. It's that idea that at the lake, it's where he finally saw Canadians spending the day together, talking, eating, drinking, talking about life, about plans, getting to know family. And this idea that for him, that was part of this idea of family, was this reciprocity of talk, right? This idea that you needed to listen to people. That's how you built family. That's how family was established. And that idea of talking about family stories, about the past, about everything. And so for him, right, it's this interesting thing where the city actually felt in a lot of ways not just quite isolating, but quite closed. And it was actually in that rural city that he found an opening. It was in that rural setting that he found the kind of talk that he recognized from home. It was in that rural setting that he found a place for himself in Canada, and also a place for his understanding of what belonging was, what family was, what membership was. It wasn't in the urban setting, it was actually in the rural setting. And again, it was related to these kinds of patterns of talk, this kind of very particular sound of the chatter of family, this exchanging stories, this listening, this building relationships in these ways. Okay, so this has kind of been a starting point for me, and now I'm trying to think about, well, what do I do with this? And so part of this is playing with the sound itself, so playing with sound from the parkland and trying to think about how I can kind of do an analysis of that, think about kind of how I can do an analysis of the sound itself in that sort of same way that I built the atlas out in that very particular visual way, to think about a sort of sonic analysis as well. But I've also been playing with different visualizations. So one example is these are just sketches from an interactive map that I'm building that kind of talks about the ways in which talk in the parkland highlights a couple of different things. It highlights this sort of distant closeness. So again, the ways in which an aunt is kind of brought back to parkland over the phone through bird sounds, but also the ways in which people find sort of attachment to lots of different places, in part through sound and also through kinds of other exchanges. So I'm building this kind of interactive atlas of parkland that's focused on waterways. And so kind of starting with waterways that are in the region, but then also this idea of adding sort of waterways from the rest of Manitoba, adding waterways from the rest of Canada that are sort of present in narratives and collective memories, but then also just adding waterways from kind of around the world that are present in these narratives, in these collective memories, in these ways that people kind of understand their place in parkland. So this is sort of like a preview of what will hopefully be a real thing in the next couple of months. And I'll skip that just for time. Okay, so just quickly to finish up, what does all of this have to do more specifically with sort of the practice of planning or the practice of environmental design more broadly? I think there are a couple of important things that happen when we start to try and look and listen in these ways, when we try and understand the relationship between the physical space and the people of the space, when we try and really understand how this works. I think one of the things that it does is it really sort of shifts the way that we think about representation, at least potentially. So both in terms of representation as a mirroring, right, how we can actually build policy or build organizations, build programs that reflect the needs of people, right? That when we look in these ways, we'll see and understand different interests, different needs, different values than we might have done if we weren't sort of looking at this relationship. Also, I think in terms of our other kinds of representations, sort of our projective representations, it can encourage us to think about how we represent the future of place in different ways. So for example, that idea of really trying to take seriously the kinds of drawings or the kinds of representations that people made about their place, even in these quick sketches, in my own sort of more formal analysis. But thinking about that in our sort of projective representations as well. I also think more generally, right, it helps us to think about what we know about the city or about the places that we're planning in a different way. So learning from people's relationships, learning about how they interact from land and space, helps us again to learn what they value in place in a very different way than in some of the more traditional sort of planning tools that we have. And more particularly, I think that this sort of embodied perspective is a distinct way of understanding value rather than the way that we often measure value. And my hope is that that idea that by valuing this process of land, by valuing this relationship to land, that we also are going to be more likely to value the bodies that are attached to land, which is not always kind of the highest and best use that we often prescribe, right? And so I was giving a talk with Zoe Todd, who's an amazing anthropologist who also works at Carleton, and we were talking about this idea of kind of this relationship between land and bodies, and talking about the idea of how the city has often been portrayed in planning as this growth machine, and thinking about the impact of that. And so one of the things that we were talking about or thinking about was the idea of what would happen if we were advocating for the city as care machine. So rather than growth machine, the city is care machine. And I think that some of these tools, these ideas of trying to understand people's bodily relationships to land, can be important tools for us to start to move towards thinking about cities as care machines. And so I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sheryl-Ann. That was great. Do we have any questions for Sheryl-Ann? Oh, I see over there already. Aaron's coming around with a mic, so you then Justin.
Hey, I just had one quick question. I was very curious, just being from Winnipeg, like what, of all the cities across Canada, like why Winnipeg, as well as maybe like Western Manitoba as well. I'm really curious what would have drawn you to studies in this area.
So I was joking about this. When I first started coming here, I was a graduate student in the States, and every single time I sat down with someone, the first thing they asked me was, what are you doing in Winnipeg? And so then I would be like, oh, I'm from Toronto. And then they would be like, no, really, what are you doing in Winnipeg? So when I started this project, right, this first project, again, like as a grad student, I was interested in this question of the relationship between sort of the economic side and the cultural side of immigration and immigration policy process. And again, being from Ontario, the Ontario government and the Manitoba government have taken very different approaches in terms of social services. I mean, up until recently, we'll see what happens in the next couple of years, obviously. But I really felt like, you know, when I got to Winnipeg, I was amazed by the amount that the province was still engaged in terms of social services. The amount of things that if you look at the Toronto city budget that are still on the provincial plate was genuinely amazing to me. And it was not a story that was being told across the country. We were being told the story of Ontario, we were being told the story of BC, we were being told the story of devolution. And so it really sort of sparked this interest, right, in the idea of what happens if we're only building urban theory around Toronto and Vancouver, which are in these very particular provincial settings. And so for me, that was sort of part of what started this interest in Winnipeg was that sort of municipal provincial relationship and this idea that we needed to tell more stories of actually what's going on in the country. We need to be building our urban theory around more cases because there's a lot of really fascinating, innovative work that's happening in cities across the country that we don't always hear about or that doesn't get raised to the national level. And then moving into Western Manitoba, when I got to Winnipeg, one of the things that's really interesting is, and you guys know this all better than me, but a lot of folks who have migrated to Winnipeg in the past little bit, especially folks who have come under refugee or asylum status, have come from rural places. And people often find Winnipeg actually quite overwhelming. which I'm not gonna lie, as a Torontonian, I was like, really? But it was a narrative that really came up as I started to do more interviews with folks who had migrated. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. I was like, oh, well, and sort of that idea of the connection between, getting new immigrants into rural places. And so I was like, oh, that's great. I'll just read all of the books that everybody has written about rural immigration in Manitoba. No big deal. And then apparently there are not a whole bunch of books written about rural immigration in Manitoba. People talk about Brandon and they talk about Thompson a lot, but they don't necessarily talk about the other regions. And Parkland has actually a really strong network, or has had. There's definitely some challenges to that are happening now, but has had a really strong network of immigrant settlement organizations. And often that's literally one person in an office, but that one person is doing a lot of really amazing work. And so kind of looking around the province, I was drawn there first because of that. But then on top of that, starting to kind of get to know the place and get to know the people, I was intrigued by this return and this staying that was happening amongst the sort of younger Canadians. So it became a really interesting comparative case, right? If we're interested in this process of how people become citizens, both looking at how that happens as you kind of move, quote unquote, into adulthood, which is shifting, obviously, and in terms of what happens when you show up in a brand new country. So, yeah. Also, Winnipeg's just great. I'm just going to say it.
Thank you for your presentation. I really like it. I just want to make a quick comment and then ask a question in regard to the presentation the part of the presentation where you looked at migration, citizenship, and then the satellite disorientation. I'm just wondering, because I look at the orientation of the satellite disk from my own experience, parts of the world where I saw different people using different satellite disk. It's based on the affordability and the maker, what the brand of the satellite disk. Like the Arab disk, usually you have to orient it towards east, so that you receive channels from those providers. And I'm just wondering, with your research in Copenhagen, in that particular neighborhood, you tend to look at a neighborhood where the immigrants are predominantly from one country, or they are from different countries but using certainly different satellite disks to tell the story, to make the connection. Because in East Africa, you find relatively homogeneous people, but they use different satellites
still
and different orientations, just to reflect like
the economic differences. That's so interesting. So I will confess, I don't actually know anything about satellite dishes. I feel like I should learn more. I should just like do a project about satellite dishes. But so there's two parts, I think, to answer the question. The first part is, so when I was choosing cases, I was actually very deliberate to try and choose places that had mixed populations, so people coming from lots of different places. So I can, if I can see, I'll try and skim back there. But that was actually a very deliberate strategy. And I think, and so part of that was that often when people do immigration studies, okay, I'm not, give me a second. Often when people do immigration studies, they focus on, I'll leave it, sorry. They focus on one population. So it'll be sort of like Turkish people in Berlin, right? Or it'll be like El Salvadorians in Boston. And it's this very focus on one population in one place, or one population maybe compared to two places. And what that does is it makes an assumption about two things. It makes an assumption, in my perspective, it makes an assumption about two things. One, it makes an assumption about a homogeneity of the people who are moving to the place, but it also makes an assumption about the homogeneity of the place itself. And so the assumption becomes that the place itself was this kind of solid formed thing that people are coming into and disrupting in a particular way. And so the idea was to instead focus on, to not focus kind of just on the actions or the experiences or the emotions of, or the cultures of people who are migrating, but to look at the ways in which the cultures and the emotions and the organizations of the places that people were arriving, also how that was having an impact. So to really acknowledge that it was a relationship and not just this idea of the city of Winnipeg as one solid thing that, you know, one group of people was coming in and disrupting, but trying to understand if and how those differences mattered once people actually got to the place. And what was actually really interesting was I often found that the differences mattered in unexpected ways. So for example, in Winnipeg, in a lot of ways, the similarities of experiences weren't about where people were coming from. They were about the ways in which they had been allowed to arrive in Canada. So wherever you were coming from, were you arriving under refugee status? Wherever you were coming from, were you a private refugee? Were you a public refugee? Were you family? Were you economic, right? That actually, in some ways, was driving more of the experience almost than just the cultural experience. Obviously, that cultural experience played a role, but actually that status meant a lot more in a lot of ways. And similarly in Copenhagen, you know, one thing that was really interesting was the difference between EU and non-EU. So Americans actually had a lot of very similar experiences to people who were moving to the country from just anywhere else not in Europe, right? Because they didn't have the automatic right to work and they didn't have sort of automatic access to resources. So there were these very sort of funny parallels between the ways in which people from the US talked about their experience and other non-Europeans from sort of quote unquote non-Western countries. And so that was part of that idea of not looking at just one group, but trying to really understand the ways in which those differences actually mattered given the context.
Yeah. Just a couple of things. One related to sound and the environment. Were you drawing connections there?
Give me one more sentence about that.
Well, the other night I lay in bed and I heard a shotgun. Ooh. And I knew it was a shotgun because I grew up in a rural environment. I wasn't afraid hearing that shotgun.
Yeah.
But I thought, what's it like to grow up in a neighborhood where you're hearing gunfire?
Yeah.
At fairly regular. That's part of your soundscape. The other thing is the trauma that when we're bringing refugees, economic, whatever, environmental, war, how do we help them? They're trying to adjust to this alien landscape, and they're dealing with trauma. And how do you talk about cities, a caring machine, as opposed to a growth machine.
Yeah.
We don't really talk about. We're not dealing with trauma within our own communities, indigenous communities, and colonial communities. Yeah. So I mean, those I don't know.
Yeah. No, for sure. I think so. I'll answer the second question first because I think. I think that honestly is part of the impetus of a lot of this work, right? Is that idea that if I'm just doing sort of a cost-benefit analysis, if I'm just doing like a purely quantitative, GIS analysis, I'm not going to find trauma. I'm not going to pay attention to it. I'm not going to attend to it. So trying to think about what are the methods that actually force me as a planner to engage with emotion, that force me as a planner to engage with these relationships to land in a different way, right? So trying to think about these methods and methodologies that actually kind of force me into thinking about that. I think, I think specifically thinking about when we talk about, say, for example, people who are coming under refugee status, there's an organization in Copenhagen called Trampolinhuset, the Trampoline House. And they started off as an arts-based organization that now does work with folks that are seeking asylum, so folks who haven't yet been given asylum but are seeking asylum. And one of the things that their founder actually starts off with, right, is actually the acknowledgement that if you've managed to get from, somewhere in East Africa, somewhere in West Asia to Copenhagen, you are better at managing systems, at navigating, at moving. Like the amount of agency that you have to actually get to that situation is way higher than it is for him who just kind of rolled up, by birth there. And so their starting point is really that starting point of that they're not sort of giving people anything so much as they are trying to kind of return something to people. And so I start there because I think, you know, I think that there's two parts to that, right? I think on the one hand, it's that part of remembering that, you know, that folks, even if folks are coming under sort of humanitarian status, the folks that are coming, again, are sort of more capable in so many ways than a lot of other people who are just kind of here. And so that's, I think, the first starting point to kind of to build our thinking that way. And then I think the other part is the part that you identify, that this idea of care isn't something that happens because you're broken. Care is something that we do all the time for each other. And so it's that idea of, on the one hand, acknowledging that there's lots of traumas in lots of different communities. So this idea of, if we could acknowledge and pay attention to the trauma in a refugee community, actually what does that help us think about the trauma in our own communities, right? But also this idea that the care that we are giving to refugee communities, the care that the city should be giving to refugee communities, should be part of a broader network of care that we want our city to be giving all of our citizens. And then, your first question?
Growing up, or
yes,
gunfire,
yeah.
being afraid rather than hearing gunfire.
Yeah.
Shoot the deer.
So, you know, I mean, I think that's interesting, and I don't have a specific response to that in terms of like gunfire in particular, but I do think, again, you know, I think one of the things that's interesting, and this is from totally different work, but I've worked with another really great organization called Fathers and Families of San Joaquin in California, and they're a re-entry program, so it's mostly folks who have been previously incarcerated who are now building this sort of system of re-entry for folks who are coming out of prisons and jails. And actually, the thing that's really interesting is actually that I think a lot of those folks would probably say that they have a similar reaction to the reaction that you have, that unfortunately they're, that unfortunately it is, it's just normal. And so that even though that sound is related to a very different outcome, right? The outcome of somebody, say, maybe hunting a deer versus the idea of the outcome of somebody, you know, of a human being being injured intentionally, that actually, you know, I think from conversations with those folks that unfortunately they would say that actually they wouldn't necessarily be super shocked by it either. But what they'll also say is that a lot of their work is actually aimed specifically at changing that. It's specifically aimed at changing the circumstances that mean that the sound of gunshot fire isn't startling to people.
Lots of thoughts running around, mostly around noise. And I use that word deliberately, which you didn't use. Because I think a lot of the time, you know, planning is about avoiding things rather than nurturing things. So, I mean, if you're in California, every California plan has a section on noise. It doesn't have a section on sound.
Yeah.
You know, so it's all about trying to avoid. And then I was sort of trying to link that, just because we're back on this one, citizenship and sound. So I was thinking about the sounds we are allowed to make when we feel like we belong. And, you know, because, you know, but I think partly what you're talking about with citizenship is the feeling of belonging.
Yeah.
But if you don't feel like you belong, can you contribute your music? Can you contribute your and I don't know how you get to some of these things, and I think it also ties into the caring city, right? Or the caring machine, because that's pitching the city as a potentially positive thing, rather than something that's just there for economic benefit of someone, and to make sure that, you know, that doesn't conflict with that.
Yeah.
And I have no idea what the question is.
Well, I will just affirm that I agree. No, but I think, yeah, even just that idea of sort of the noise ordinance versus the sound ordinance, right? Like, even in and of itself, that's like a really important, I know, it's not great. Even in and of itself, I think that is an important distinction, right? That idea that so much of planning is about what we don't want, and that we don't spend enough time thinking about sort of proactively what we do want. Right? And that cuts across all sorts of different fields of planning, whether that's environmental planning and thinking about sort of, you know, the environmental impact assessment process. I teach a class in that tomorrow, which is why I'm thinking about it. But, you know, that process is all about sort of, you know, not having environmental harms rather than thinking about how could every project increase sustainability, right? That, like, yeah, so many of our processes are about keeping out what we don't want as opposed to really thinking about what we want to bring in. So I would just concur.
Any other questions? I have a question, actually. I have a microphone. No, so my question is, when I first saw the poster with the blurb and everything, my first thought was, okay, you want to talk about land, and my first thought, whenever I hear the word land now, is like Canada's a colonial country, and what does it mean to talk about land in this context? And you've touched on that a little bit, but I guess my question is, in the analysis that you've presented today, particularly the North American examples, do you think that recognizing Canada as a colonial country, thinking about what it means to interact with a colonial state, questions of belonging, how do those all change when we bring reconciliation, when we bring decolonization, when we bring returns of land into the question, into the conversation? Like, how does that kind of shift the discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and so that's kind of, and again, that's sort of part of the secret title, right? Is an acknowledgement that on the one hand, I know and think that that's a very, very important question, and on the other hand, I acknowledge that my work has not addressed it enough. And so again, part of the secret title is that move towards trying to address it in a better way. And so I think that's, and I think part of that addressing it in a better way, again, is this idea of trying to understand how land is valued in a different way, right? So even if you look at like sort of the California case, right, we're not necessarily talking about an indigenous community, right, but talking about, folks who still have really strong sort of spiritual connection to land. And spirituality is not something that we're supposed to talk about in planning. That's like very weird, right? But also, but then sort of, transposing that back, right? If we look at so many, across the country, right, so many different indigenous laws sort of involve, right, that much less instrumental relationship to land. Right? So it's a relationship that is a process, and it's a relationship that's a process that's between a contemporary population, but a future population, a past population, a non-human population. And so again, I think for me, the hope is that sort of trying to think more and more in that way will help me to sort of better understand the laws that I'm supposed to be living under, working now in Algonquin territory or working in Treaty 1 or Treaty 2 territory, right? That hopefully that will help me to understand more and more the laws that I'm supposed to be working under. And then as somebody that teaches people who are interested in going out and engaging in land use practices, right? Whether it's through environmental design or through land use design or through, even community design, hopefully being able to share that more with them so that we can kind of think together around what that practice looks like. Like, what does that practice look like when we are, when we're building policy based on the laws that we're actually supposed to be involved in. And that was part of that conversation with Zoe around that idea of a caring machine, was for her talking about sort of, some of the starting points of a lot of Cree law being about sort of care and about love, right? And so, if you're in Cree territory and that's the basis of Cree law, right, what does it mean then to plan to that law? But the sort of the blurriness is the acknowledgement that I have not engaged enough in it yet. So, yeah. Thank you.
This is your last chance for a question.
Have you been to the Pinkin? Or not Mackinac, actually, Mackinac. South of St. Louis.
Oh, yeah. 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 I'm not going to tell you the story of the 3 or 4 different French schools in St. Rose. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that.
All right. Thank you very much, Sheryl-Ann.